Good afternoon, everyone. And I know how you are waiting for this session. And today's much-awaited debate hinges on the notion this House believes that there are too many airway guidelines. Our debaters will unravel this topic, but before we dive in, the stakes are high, and every vote matters. So please cast your vote, I hope it's coming on whether the airway landscape is overcrowded with guidelines. Thank you, Sajay. While we are doing that, let me invite our two titans onto the stage. Going in first is the charismatic Professor William Harrod Griffiths, or Dr. Rebel for today, as we promised to call him, who argues that there are too many airway guidelines. And he says that it's like too many cooks in the kitchen, and you come up with a confusing recipe which no one wants to follow. And coming up afterwards will be our guidelines connoisseur, legendary Dr. Imran Ahmed, who believes that guidelines are like North Pole, guiding us through the labyrinth of medical choices. So let's buckle up for this banter-infused clash, and I hope you're all voting. Every vote matters. Oh, wow. This is going to be interesting. Don't make it too easy for them. Stakes are high. Every vote matters. You can see that every vote matters. Okay. While we are getting the last votes in, I'll invite our first speaker, Dr. Rebel, to see if he can swing the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If AV could give me if you could mirror the main screen on the slave, that'd be fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Perfect. It is with an immense amount of pleasure and not a little trepidation that I stand before you, the serried ranks of the members of the Difficult Airway Society, and have the temerity to suggest that this House believes that there are too many airway management guidelines. My name is indeed Dr. Rebel or William Harrod Griffiths. I offer you no QR codes like Elbog Dadley, but I offer you an email address, willhg@pm.me. Email me, and you'll get the whole presentation by return. Let me first dispense with any suspicion that you might have that I will deride my colleague. My opponent today is unutterably a man of the utmost honesty, integrity, and propriety. I will not utter any words against him, nor will I stoop so low as to show embarrassing or humorous images of him. Although tragically deluded, he is an admirable and estimable opponent whom I genuinely wish the very best of luck. Let me next dispense with a few semantics and definitions. I know that Imran will not object to the first two. Firstly, I will define guidelines as information intended to advise people on how things should be done. I will define emergency drills as clear sets of instructions that support human performance during emergencies and that are meant to be practiced in advance. He will not agree with the next bit, but I will describe and define as algorithms as almost inevitable byproducts of well-intended guidelines that include far too many colored text boxes linked by bidirectional arrows that are almost completely useless in an emergency. I will assert to you in the course of the next 15, call it 20 minutes, that there are too many airway guidelines internationally, that there are too many airway guidelines nationally, that we need to reform the guideline industry and the airway guideline industry significantly, that guideline does not have to mean lots of algorithms, and that I hate algorithms. No, really, honestly, I really, really hate algorithms. I've created for you a word cloud of who might benefit from guidelines. And I'm going to give you those names in order. But the people who benefit the most from guidelines are not even in that word cloud because they are the authors. Believe me, their H-index becomes positively tumescent when they publish a guideline. The second person, the people or organizations who benefit second most are also not there. They are the journals, and we've already heard that the most cited publication of the British Journal of Anesthesia is a guideline. Their citation index and impact factor swells significantly with the publication of each airway guideline. Now, specialist societies are third. They benefit because they get a lot of kudos from the publication. They own that area, they get a lot of attention, and they can build lots of sessions into their meetings. The police, genuinely, they have been known to put the paper version of guidelines into evidence bags and march them off when they march off the anaesthetist, blaming the anaesthetist for gross negligence manslaughter. Lawyers love them because they are a stick with which lawyers will beat you if you do not follow those guidelines. Some doctors I know enjoy guidelines, but I don't think they are in the majority. And the people who come last, tragically, in the list of beneficiaries are the patients themselves. There is almost no evidence whatsoever that patients benefit from guidelines. The only evidence I could find after hours and hours of looking was for this guideline published by the Association of the Management of Hypertension. They actually went back 4 years later and proved that the guideline had worked. There is an incredible paucity of solid proof that guidelines, airway or not, actually work. I put it to you that there are too many international guidelines. There are, as you will know better than anybody else, British guidelines. There are American guidelines, there are Canadian guidelines, there are French guidelines, there are German guidelines exclusively in German. There are Italian guidelines, there are Swiss, not just Swiss, but Swiss Latin guideline, which is like a guideline to a paso doble rhythm. There are all India guidelines, there are Scandinavian guidelines, there are South African guidelines, there are all African guidelines, there are Chinese guidelines, there are Australian and New Zealand guidelines, and even 3 days ago the bloody Europeans got in on the act and published their own pediatric airway guidelines. There are too many guidelines, and this is for one species. Homo sapiens. And before you say, yes, but there are different languages, there are different resources, here are 4 countries with their own guideline who speak the same language, and 2 of them have even the same bloody flag. There are too many guidelines nationally. Okay, so here are some guidelines. Here's an overview guideline, plan A, B, C, D, and this is an underview guideline that comes next, A, B, C, D. In the same publication, there's no plan B. Really, it dropped out of that one for that one, and there's another one which is a more detail about plan. Sorry, those are 20-year-old guidelines. I'd forgotten those are 2004. We must have some more recent, only 10-year-old guidelines where there are plan A, B, C, D there, and plan A, B, C, D there, and D has changed because it's only scalpel cricothyrotomically. But hang on, what happens if the patient is pregnant? They're no longer plans, they're algorithms, and this is an overview algorithm of 3 other algorithms. There's a green algorithm, which I quite like. There's an orange algorithm, I don't like the color orange. And there's a red and yellow algorithm. But hang on, what happens if it's a child? Then you don't need plans or algorithms, you need steps. Step A, step B, step C comes there, but hang on, what happens if they're in the intensive care unit? You need different things. You need to combine plan. What? There are just too many of these things around. And these are all for just putting the tube in. I have this recurring nightmare in which a trainee phones me up and says, Dr. Harry Griffiths, I've got to go up to the ITU to intubate a pregnant child with a difficult airway. Which guideline do I take? I said, take all of them, take all of them. What's wrong with guidelines? Okay, I wrote down a list of what was wrong with guidelines, and then I read this editorial by Hans Heitink, and it was pretty much the same list. So shout out to him, he got there 7 years ago. Anyone can have a go. Big specialist societies, small specialist societies, old specialist societies, new specialist societies deliberately created just to produce a new airway guideline. They do exist. Two specialist societies can come together to create a guideline or come together with other specialists. People who aren't even a specialized society can create their own guidelines. There are several of those. And the structured guideline process is hardly ever followed. I won't go into it in detail because time is relatively short, but there should be structure to guideline production that is often not followed. Journal-published guidelines are set in stone until the next one comes along. And we've just heard that the gap between guidelines is 10 years. The ASA, 2003, 2013, 2022. DAS, 2004, 2015, 2025. Evidence emerges all the time in these 10-month epochs, which you may have to take into account when guiding people and managing airways. Bits of kit come, bits of kit go. Trends appear, techniques become trendy, and then they fall out of popularity. Authors, sadly, tend to be self-appointed experts or their friends. I mean, they're nice people, don't get me wrong, but you do see them in the bar together in the evening, don't you? It sort of creates the perfect echo chamber for their opinions that goes round and round and round, and as we'll see in about 5 minutes, produces some rather strange effects. Very few working parties have what I call real people. That's basically you guys who give anesthetics for a living 5 days a week rather than sitting in committees for 4.5 days a week. Their recommendations are rarely trialed or peer-reviewed, and they're rarely evaluated after release, which they should be, and that really doesn't happen. But the thing that I hate most of all about guidelines, I hate the bloody algorithms. I really hate them. And I say this, the success of complex algorithms for emergency use depends on those involved in the emergency understanding the algorithm and remaining calm. And the two most important words here are understanding and calm. Up to 20% of people in this country are dyslexic. Many more are neurodiverse in other ways. For those up to 20 to 25% of people, this guideline, in an attractive green, in an emergency situation, looks much more like this. It is not for them to use the guidelines. Now, when things do go slightly wrong, we all hope that we keep remarkably calm. We hope to be a little bit like that man. Behavioral studies in human beings show that that's tragically wrong, and only up to 10% of people stay like James Bond. Most of us, 60 to 80%, are like the person on the left. I'm one of those when the shit hits the fan. I just go, yeah, and? Up to 20% of people panic and run around like headless chickens. When any of this is happening, those up to 90% of people, what the last thing they need is a bloody algorithm. What they need is skills and drills. Fundamental technical anesthetic skills that they practice over and over again till they become second nature, and linear drills, emergency drills that they just go down when somebody reads out to them, and they follow and they practice and they practice and they practice. Like that. That's what you need when that hits the fan. You don't need a complex algorithm. But what you get given is one of those bloody things. You get a malgorithm. Okay. The Difficult Airway Society in 2015 was very, very clear, saying these algorithms, the algorithms that accompany these guidelines are not intended, they're intended as teaching and learning tools and have not been specifically designed to use as prompts during an airway. Why put in specifically? If you take specifically out, it would be honest, but they know they're going to be used as emergency drills, and they rather want them to. So much so that on their website, you can download the guideline algorithm as a PDF file, which prints perfectly to an A4 sheet, which you can laminate and put on your anesthetic machine. And because they know this is going to happen, they put the logo and the year of production in the corner, because they know that that is going to happen. Secretly, DAS, you like algorithms. But you are not the worst culprit of algorithmitis. It is our American cousins from across the water in this ghastly publication in 2022. They even shout out loud, call for help, optimize oxygenation. When appropriate, refer to an algorithm. Do you know when it's appropriate to refer to an algorithm? Never is it appropriate to refer to an algorithm. Look at the bloody algorithm. That's for children, or pediatric patients, as they call it. Let me show you the attention to detail by expanding one bit of that. Assess oxygentation. What is oxygentation? Who created that algorithm? They can't even spell, and the journal people didn't even look at it. But ladies and gentlemen, what could be worse than an algorithm? I back Kareem all the way. It's an infographic. This infographic, to me, makes no sense whatsoever. It accompanied that American guideline. Let's expand this. Less than or equal to 3 + 1. What? I looked through the entire paper, it doesn't mention it at all. And if you want to say less than or equal to 3 + 1, just say less than 5. It makes a lot more sense. Stay time. What? What's stay time? Can you freeze time if you're in America when you've got an airway problem? It makes no sense whatsoever. Fresh off the press, the ink barely dry on this paper. Apologies, I know there are people who wrote this in the audience. No, I make no apologies. It's another bloody algorithm. Nice shade of green, mind. Nice shade of bottle green. That's all I can say about this one. But it comes with an infographic of 2 vortices joined by what might be the infinity sign, or could be a rubber band, so that when they rotate in different directions. I have no idea. Let's zoom out a few bits of this. Attempts? What's an attempt? You've obviously given your tea to the Americans. I mean, what is this? Consider emerging a patient is not English. You do not emerge a patient. ECMO, in which planet do you live? Oh, quick, I can't put the tube in. Get the ECMO. That doesn't happen. As Tim Cook pointed out, in less than 50% of cardiac centers in this country can you get an ECMO device for an emergency like that. And what else is this? Evaluate for task fixation. Loss of aversion. Quick, we've lost the aversion. What is loss of aversion? Loss of aversion doesn't exist. There is a thing called loss aversion, which I only heard about 3 days ago when I read this wonderful paper. Please, for the love of God, stop. To quote a Canadian colleague, Laura Duggan, dans une jungle de directives sur les rois aériennes, il est temps de tracer un chemin commun. Or, in a forest of air guideline, let's find a shared path. I got so excited when I saw this paper. I thought, at last, this is it, nirvana, a single guideline to rule all. I want to sit, I have a picture of this at home. Look that hour, that is the best thing about that guideline, isn't it? That the esophagus can make itself look, if it wants to, like a trachea. So even if you use a video laryngoscope, you can still put the tube in the wrong place. Remember that message, it's important. They couldn't help it. They produced an algorithm, and I hate this algorithm. Not only do they produce it, but they said, high-resolution version available for download, printing and laminating this in A3 size, so that it's bigger than the DAS guideline. Do you know, dear God, I'm not going to deconstruct this, because I know a lot of people think this is really good. I'll simply say this. Is removing the tube dangerous? I have been practicing anesthesia now for more than 41 years. I know it's difficult to believe, but for more than 41 years. And I try to think, have I ever been in a situation where it's better for the patient to leave the tube in when the COT rate is a bit dodgy than take, it hasn't happened once. And I'm not particularly good, and I'm not particularly clever. And to suggest that in an algorithm where all the red arrows go to remove tube and all the green arrows going yes, leave to leave tube, to me, I'm just going to leave it there because I know people like it, and I don't want to upset you. This is what we need. 2 minutes, Chair, that's all I've got. Quick reference handbook, association with anesthetists, everything presented, linear. Somebody reads it out, somebody who can read, adequate oxygen delivery, poor surgery possible, increased fresh gas flow. This is what you need in an emergency situation, and this is what the one guideline covering everything should cover. Even Resus Council UK have cottoned on. They produce these unpleasant algorithms, but at the bottom of that list on their page online, you'll see they've done it all as a quick reference handbook. This is what we need. We need to practice it, and that's what it looks like. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. What we need is very few live, curated, online guidelines which can change over time, that they should ideally cover almost all members of the Homo sapiens species, the big ones, the small ones, the old ones, the young ones. Please, if you possibly can. I want them written by experts, because the so-called experts are experts in many respects, but real experts like you, the people who actually give anesthetics for a living. I want, please, just cut down the algorithms, please, but with emergency drills that can be practiced and practiced and practiced, because when all is said and done, it's so much more about human factors than anything else. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, Professor, for infusing a dose of laughter into this lively discussion. But let's keep the momentum going and invite our guidelines connoisseur, DAS President, Dr. Imran Ahmed, to add his distinctive perspective to this discussion.
Lovely, thank you. That's a hard act to follow. I'll bring it back on track again, shall I? I did use artificial intelligence. I described both of us. As you can see, it generated a very image of me and slightly different one for William. So there are too many airway guidelines is the question, and I'm going to actually say, are there too many airway guidelines as the question? Now, William I'm against this, as you're aware, and William is for this. William very kindly sent me a few pictures while I was writing the talk, so I thought I'd use them. This is one of his interests, which is cycling, and I thought I'd give it real justice and make sure you can see all of it, because I think it's worth seeing. He looks a lot bigger up there than he does down here, but he's obviously a very keen cyclist. I've got my own pictures of William. This I took when I was at a DAS committee meeting at the Association of Anaesthetists. This wonderful portrait of William and his lovely family. In this one, he's reading. So I was quite interested in what he was reading. So I sort of did a bit of research. And after a bit of research, I realised that even in his portrait, he's actually reading the extubation guidelines, funnily enough. And I have that on authority. So, are there too many airway guidelines? And you know what? I agree. There are many airway guidelines. I completely agree. I did a PubMed search. I'm trying to put a bit of science and evidence behind what I'm saying. There are, when I did the search, there were 681 results. He's absolutely right. There are many guidelines. The first recognized first recognized airway guidelines were published in 1993 by the ASA. And that was followed by some other guidelines, 98 Americans and various other countries. And in 2004 were the big ones from DAS. And since then, many other countries have written guidelines. So I completely agree, there are many guidelines. And not only are there many guidelines across many countries, within countries there are many guidelines. So we have 9 at DAS, and there's loads internationally. Why are there many guidelines? There must be a reason for this. The guidelines serve specific purposes. They're for specific reasons, different aspects of airway management. Not all airway management is the same. They're tailored approaches to specific clinical scenarios. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail. Unfortunately, again, I'll put a bit of evidence behind what I'm saying. There's this publication by Edelman, a review on difficult airway management algorithms. So a lot of this work has been done for us already. And these were a number of publications and algorithms and guidelines that they accumulated, that they found over the years when they did their search. And in fact, what they found was there were 38 difficult airway management algorithms written by 14 recognized societies. Since then, that's a few years old, there's about 17 guidelines developed by national airway societies and about 43 algorithms. So I completely agree, there are a lot. We're in the UK, we're at a DAS conference, maybe we should focus on the DAS guidelines, and at the moment there are nine of them that are active. Some have been reviewed, but they are active. Now, I did a little Google search on my esteemed colleague, and I mean, he's very impressive, as you can see, but I won't dwell on that too much. But his clinical interests are that it includes orthopedics, obstetrics, and vascular anesthesia. So in his practice, He doesn't need to worry about the US guidelines or the Canadian guidelines or the Australian guidelines or the Indian guidelines. He needs to maybe just think about the DAS guidelines. He's based in the UK. He practices in the UK. That gives us 9 guidelines. Now, of those 9 guidelines, how many of them are relevant to his practice? None of the critical care ones, maybe not the pediatric ones, maybe not the hematoma guidelines. The ones that are relevant to his practice are the intubation guidelines and the obstetric guidelines, if he's going to intubate anybody, which doesn't happen very often. And if he intubates, I agree, he may need to extubate. So we're taking it down to maybe 2, maybe 3 guidelines that are relevant to his practice. Let's say he has a patient who needs an awake intubation, which he probably doesn't do very often. Maybe he does, but he may need some guidance on that. So he could use the ATI guidelines to help him with that, and he may want to extubate that patient afterwards. So that's down to 2. And maybe during COVID, he may have had help with the odd intubation, and in which case he would need the 1 guideline. So actually, it's not about multiple guidelines that are relevant to your practice. Yes, there are many out there, but they're not all relevant to all of us. So I've put this graphic together, which is the WHG myths, and one of his myths is, I don't know which guideline to use, and I think that's complete nonsense. You do know which guideline you need to use in your practice because you do that all the time. The other thing I found quite interesting when I went through William's bio was this comment about his non-clinical interests, which include riding horses, bicycles, and motorcycles, and his passion or his main aim is not to fall off a horse, a bicycle, and a motorcycle. And again, William was very kind to send me some pictures of him riding a horse, riding a bike, and riding a motorcycle. Now, he enjoys going from A to B on a device which he rides. On all 3 devices, he's wearing protective headgear and he's sitting down. But that's where this similarity ends. Yes, he's riding, but he's riding different devices and different modalities and different techniques. When he goes on his bike, are you telling me he stands there and goes vroom, 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 vroom on his... No, I don't think he does that. That's sort of not what he does when he's on a motorbike. When he is on a bicycle, when he's on his horse, does he put a leathers on and a biker's helmet and shoves a couple of handlebars in the horse's neck? No, that's not what you do when you're riding a horse. And when he's on his motorbike, does he wear his cowboy gear and start saying giddy up and put reins on the motorbike? No, you don't do that when you're riding a motorbike. So you have different disciplines for riding in his hobbies. And it's the same for airway management. Different disciplines require different skills, different techniques, different equipment. And that's why you have different algorithms helping you and guiding you and putting you in the right frame for when you're managing those specific situations. Not all of them are relevant to all of us all of the time, but some of them are relevant to some of us some of the time, and that's when you need them. So this myth about me going to ITU and intubating this horse who's pregnant and I don't know which algorithm to use, nonsense. You do know which one you need to use, and that doesn't happen as often as he may make out. And let's go back to that review. And if you look at the different types of algorithms, you know, there are different types of algorithms because there are different types of disciplines and different types of airway management that we have to manage and deal with, and that's why we have so many different types. Each discipline requires different skill sets, so not all airway management is the same, which is what William, I think, is trying to tell us, because if it was, then you would have the one algorithm, but we don't. Now, some of the things that they came up with in this review, again, I'm quoting them because these are quotes from other papers, is that difficult airway management algorithms, along with cognitive aids, may reduce cognitive overload at stressful times, as William alluded to, and provide a framework for appropriate decision-making at a very stressful time when things are difficult to do. So a well-planned and well-designed algorithm is really important. Before the advent of published algorithms, difficult airway management depended solely on the experience of skilled individuals. You would keep trying to intubate a patient for half an hour, 45 minutes in the olden days. That's not the case anymore, fortunately, for good reason. And airway management recommendations allow for a streamlined and standardized patient care, which aims to improve patient outcomes. So when we hear that there's no evidence there's improvement in patient outcomes, there is, and I'll come to that in a second. And arguably one of the most important airway papers ever published in the UK, maybe in the world, is the NAP4 study from eminent people, lots of data, lots of experience, and even they suggest that there's a very strong recommendation for the adoption of airway algorithms because it may help improve patient outcomes. So should we ignore what these guys have said and listen to my esteemed colleague? Well, we can listen to him, but I would rather listen to these guys. So there is no need for any airway guidelines. I think that's something that I would definitely disagree with. We've mentioned this paper already. It's a great paper, and it's had a lot of impact. One aspect of it which I want to focus on, just to show you the importance of guidelines, is let's look at the number of attempts at intubation. William's already alluded to the number of less than 3, more than 3, less than 5, whatever the number is. But let's look at the number of intubation attempts. Look back at 1994, by this paper by Rose. What they stated, what they found when they did a massive review of lots of patients was that conventional practice of repeated attempts at laryngoscopy to secure difficult intubation was itself associated with significant patient morbidity. The more attempts you have, the more morbidity that you got. So that was in 1994. 10 years later, this big series was published in 2004 by Mort, and they found exactly the same thing, and this was still happening. There was a significant increase in the rate of airway-related complications as the number of laryngoscopic attempts increased. The more attempts you have, the more likely you are to cause problems. And they even gave numbers, and you can see it's quite obvious that the more attempts you have, the more problems you were getting. But we knew that 10 years ago, but we were still having numerous attempts at intubation. They suggest you refrain from persistent attempts. It's only when this was put into the guidelines that it's become part of normal practice that we don't have multiple attempts. You don't keep going. This is when we started to understand this. It was in 2004, then 2015 we wrote the same thing. It's now become part of our normal practice not to have multiple attempts because we know now that it does cause problems. But we've known this way back, since 1994, but only until it became part of a guideline that it became part of our normal practice. So, and that's just one aspect. There's many other aspects. I'm just giving you one example of how guidelines can help change your practice. This is a nice paper by Crosby, and looking at guidelines and whether there are any help or not. Again, published data, and it says specialist societies are ideally placed to write guidelines. Guidelines promote interventions with proven benefits and discourage ineffective ones, have a potential to reduce morbidity and mortality. So they do have an effect, and they can be positive. So this myth of guidelines don't help, I completely disagree with. Do algorithms improve outcomes? Again, there are lots of papers that have done before and after, so before data, intervention, and after, and compared the two. And in lots of papers, it's been very clear that routine application of an algorithmic approach to failed intubation is associated with much higher salvage success rates and therefore better outcomes. So this myth of no evidence that guidelines improve patient outcomes, I'm afraid I, again, disagree with. So, we're sort of on the same page here, which is one airway guideline for all. Is that the answer? If you're saying there are too many guidelines, then maybe we should have just the one guideline. And actually, we're going to go back to the same editorial. We're going to go back, well, this is the editorial that preceded the Puma paper. That was in 2020. And they were talking about a universal single guideline, which is internationally consistent. So one guideline for the whole world, independent of level of training, for every level of training, for every discipline, basically anybody that manages an airway, regardless of the context, regardless if it's routine, if it's elective, has one algorithm. Okay? This is basically what I think William is alluding to. We have too many, let's have the one. So that was, so in 2020, we were awaiting this fantastic magical guideline, and all we got was a methodology paper followed by a few other papers that are coming out, and we're in 2023 and we're still waiting for all of this to come through. Maybe it's because it's impossible to do, maybe because it's very difficult to do, but having one algorithm for all airway management, I think, is not easy. And actually, this will probably end up being a meta guideline of all the other guidelines that are out there. So it's not something that's easy to do. So having just the one guideline, we're still waiting for, and I think it's very, very difficult to produce that, because what you end up producing is something very, very complicated. And I'm glad William brought this up, because I brought the algorithm up, because this is what an algorithm would look like if it was, and this is only looking at a failed intubation. It's not even looking at extubation or anticipated difficult intubation. And look how complicated this algorithm is. You just cannot follow this algorithm. So this myth of one algorithm is easy to follow, I think, is not doable. Finally, I'm glad that this was brought up. They do it to get their name on a paper. And you know, maybe to some degree this happens. I mean, this is an example of a paper where there's 100 co-authors on this paper, and this is a guideline on recommendations for effective documentation on regional anesthesia. And it's a very good paper. I've read it myself, and numerous number of co-authors on there. And you know, maybe, just maybe, on this occasion, I will agree with William about that topic. So, in summary, what I'd like to say is, are there too many airway guidelines, was the question. And I think no, but there are many airway guidelines. Like there are many ways to go riding. Each discipline requires a specific skill. You can't merge them all into one and do everything in one go. That's just not possible. It doesn't happen. You have to have specific equipment, specific skills, specific practices, specific mentality for managing different types of airways. You can't merge them all into one, and I don't think that's the right thing to do. Because if you do, you end up with something like this, which is just impossible to follow. Or if you want to become this was for medical students, how do you decide what specialty you want to be? And it's quite a complicated algorithm, and it's all about whether you like hammers or not. And if you're wondering what the anesthesia one is, it's this. You should like rubber hammers because you can knock them out, and not a construction hammer, otherwise you'd be an orthopedic surgeon. Very difficult to follow, very difficult to understand. Please don't go for the jokes and the myths, because let's use evidence, let's use common sense, and specific scenarios require specific skills and specific equipment and specific mindsets. So not all guidelines are relevant to all of our practices. Only some guidelines are relevant to our practices. Guidelines are designed to help and standardize care, improve safety, and should be easy to follow. I completely agree on that one. Having just one guideline for all airway scenarios is way too complicated. I don't think it's possible, and I think you need to have specific guidelines for specific situations. Otherwise, you end up with some ones that are just very difficult to follow. And that's me done. Thank you very much.
All right, lovely audience. I think after a lively exchange of wit and wisdom, I think it's time for you to decide. It's decision time, and let's all vote again on whether there are too many airway guidelines. Consider it the most important vote you'll do today.
So I was slightly ahead to start off with.
People are still waiting for you. Oh, what's gone up?
God, no, don't go, no. People who vote for you are slower, aren't they?
We can take one question while we are voting. Anybody has a question while we are voting? And I know Kareem is there, but don't try to influence the vote. Yes? I'm being fair and firm.
I won't try and influence the vote. I just had a question. Professor Harp Griffiths, your last slide was emphasizing the importance of human factors. Do you know where I'm going?
I've heard of human factors, yes.
What do you think of the DAS human factors guidelines?
Are there human factors guidelines? Who wrote them? Did they have good algorithms in them?
They did, and they were published earlier this year. They're fantastic guidelines on human factors.
And they were led by Fiona Kelly, who is fantastic as well. So I've actually read those guidelines. I think it's the only set of guidelines I've ever read.
So he agrees that there is a role for guidelines in difficult airway society. Very good. Thank you very much. Just
Thank you.
Just in response to that, I was misrepresented by my estimable opponents saying I didn't believe in guidelines. I believe in guidelines, but I don't believe in as many guidelines as he would wish us have.
I didn't say we need more guidelines. I just said that I don't think there are too many guidelines.
I think no, we should stop. Okay. So results are out, and we can all see who's emerged victorious. Round of applause. That hug says it all. But a round of applause for both of them for our witty debates and turning this afternoon into a delightful comedy, I would say. Thank you very much, everyone.
So can I just say that we're going to, what we thought we'd do is, so we can finish earlier, we might just move on to the next session now, cut that short, and then we'll be able to finish early instead of break for coffee and then come back for the final session. So please, if you don't mind just staying, we'll probably do this session over the next 20 minutes, half an hour, then we'll do the awards ceremony. So if I can please invite the presidents up for the president's session, if that's okay, and then we'll get started a bit earlier than planned, and then we'll break for coffee.